Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, the 360-degree Cloud Readiness Framework, Accelerating Your Organization's Cloud Transformation. My name is Mikiko Ara. I'm the Director of Marketing for Total Product Marketing, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar today. So before we get started, there's a few people still jumping on, but I'd like to cover just a couple of things. We have left about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for a Q&A. So if you do have any questions during or after the presentations, please enter it in the chat pane to the right of your screen here. And we'll try to get to all the questions that we can. Also, this slide deck, as well as the accompanying white paper and recording, will be sent to you after the presentation. Today's webinar will be presented by Mr. Eric Marks, the Vice President of Cloud Consulting and for Cloud Spectator. Eric is a 25-year veteran in the IT industry with companies such as PricewaterhouseCoopers, Cambridge Technology Partners, and Agile Path Corporation. He's also the author of 6 business and technology strategy books, including The Executive's Guide to Cloud Computing, Service-Oriented Architecture, and The Executive's Guide to Web Services. He currently spearheads the Cloud Consulting Division of Cloud Spectator. Cloud Spectator is a cloud benchmarking and consulting agency focused on cloud infrastructure as a service. The company helps cloud providers understand their market position and helps enterprises make intelligent decisions on cloud strategy, cloud readiness, cloud reduction, or cost reduction, and vendor analysis. The firm was founded in early 2011 and is located in Boston, Massachusetts. So without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Eric Marks. So take it away, Eric.
Thank you, Mikiko, and welcome everybody to this webinar today. It's an exciting topic called Cloud Readiness, and in this webinar we'll be presenting our 360 Cloud Transformation Readiness Model, which surprisingly is still a very important activity that organizations are performing to see what they need to do to be ready to adopt cloud computing to drive to a set of business and organizational goals. So before we get into the framework itself, we should talk about what cloud readiness really is. In our view, cloud readiness, it's a process that enables enterprise cloud transformation through a very comprehensive evaluation of the organization's ability to adopt, consume, and operate cloud services, not only efficiently, but securely, and again, with the intent to drive a specified set of business and technology objectives. The model we've created, our 360 Cloud Readiness Framework, is a capability model, and when we use that phrasing, we're contrasting it with maturity models, which we all have seen and know and love over the years. But a cloud readiness capability model does focus in on the broad set of business, organizational, and technical capabilities that are necessary to ensure the success of cloud computing in a given enterprise. Maturity models, in our view, tend to be a little more static. They're snapshots in time of where an organization is with respect to a specified set of processes, but they don't lead to as much of a dynamic approach to evolving capabilities that drive to cloud computing success. That's our opinion. We have a capability model as opposed to a maturity model. So why is cloud readiness important? Well, as we all have seen, cloud computing tends to be quite a strategic initiative, especially these days, given that it's more or less in the early mainstream adoption phase. So it's accelerating. There's a lot of intent and excitement about the cloud computing industry. But with cloud being a strategic initiative, it does help to have a third-party readiness assessment performed to help provide the independent evaluation of the overall capabilities that will either make it or break it. Second, cloud is challenging to most organizations. It fundamentally changes procurement processes, decision-making, governance and oversight, IT operations, and application development and delivery, as well as the organizational structure of an organization. So this challenge, the many challenges that cloud computing exposes are either opportunities to run and hide or to step up to the plate, swing for the fence, and meet them. Last, this readiness framework does position an organization for a cloud transformation. So it helps provide the essential information you'll need to determine where your capabilities are ready, where they're not quite so ready, and it does provide answers and a roadmap to help you address any of those gaps and deficiencies that are there. So those are three fundamental reasons why cloud readiness is important and why we're seeing such an uptick in demand for cloud readiness. Some basic definitions will help us as we navigate the rest of the webinar. You've heard the phrase cloud first used. We've done a lot of government consulting in cloud. Cloud first was used down in Washington, D.C. across every civilian and Department of Defense agency. So it's a phrase that we hear used to emphasize cloud computing as a priority unless there's some specific reason where cloud isn't the answer. So you'll hear cloud first used a lot. And in my view, cloud first is where you're really adding cloud into your existing capabilities and enterprise. And so while it makes cloud a priority, cloud in this kind of a view and a cloud first view is additive. Now contrast that with cloud native, which in my view refers to cloud as being looked at as a first principle, a first organizing principle in thinking about the fundamental organizational design, the business model design, products and services. So think about cloud native as where you're thinking cloud from the very first thought all the way end to end across the value chain. So cloud first is where you're adding it. Cloud native is where cloud is the first principle of intent. You can see the difference. So it's also useful that we contrast and define what a business capability is. So a business capability is the expression or articulation of the capacity, materials, expertise that an enterprise needs in order to perform the functions of its enterprise value chain. So when you think about business capabilities across an enterprise, it's these various capabilities that will either allow cloud computing to be more adopted and more successful, or some of those capabilities may inhibit cloud adoption. So it's the intent of this cloud readiness framework to help identify the various business capabilities and how they will help or hinder successful cloud adoption. And lastly, maturity model. Again, as we contrasted the capability model versus maturity model before, a maturity model is a snapshot in time of the organization's capabilities and processes to see where the organization is on some predefined maturity scale. They tend to be subjective, they tend to be static, and they're not as useful as a capability model. So that's just some basic definitions to pave the way for the rest of the webinar. Two other ideas to think about. Think about the idea of cloud incrementalism versus transformation. So they're both two slightly different approaches to what cloud computing means for an enterprise. So let's talk about the two differences. From a strategy perspective, the more incremental approach to cloud, that's where cloud first comes into the forefront. However, from a transformational perspective, on a strategy basis, cloud native is what the strategy is when you're looking at cloud transformation. When you're looking at the business focus for cloud, in the incremental approach, that's really where you're adding cloud or you're cloud enabling the IT infrastructure and IT operations processes, the infrastructure provisioning processes of the enterprise. That tends to be the focal point when you're doing an incremental cloud adoption. However, when you're looking at a cloud transformation, you're looking across the entire value chain, the business model, the strategy, the operating model, and IT included. So from a cloud transformation perspective, the business focus is much broader when you're looking at a cloud transformation. From the vision perspective, again, the vision here is that you'll end up with cloud-enabled IT infrastructure and the supporting processes. In a transformational view, the vision is that cloud becomes the future state and it sets the stage for competitive advantage over time. If you think about the organizational integration, in the incremental model, cloud in this view is a limited kind of a cloud-first strategy. But from the transformational side of this is where you embed and drive cloud deeply into business, into operations, and even into products and services. From an end-state goal, the incremental model is to achieve a multi-cloud hybrid kind of an operating environment. In the transformational model, Cloud's goal is to reinvent the business model, to redesign processes, to reimagine how your enterprise is going to work based on a cloud foundation. So if you think about cloud incrementalism and cloud transformation, they're both great. They're both valuable. They both have value to the enterprise. It's just that one is a more narrow view of what cloud can do for you, and one is a much more aggressive stance. Why does that matter? Well, over the years of doing cloud consulting with various organizations, we've arrived at what we call these 5 cloud strategy archetypes. And that can actually apply to any kind of a strategy, but we're using them in a cloud computing context here. These 5 strategy archetypes, strategy first, strategy backfill, strategy reset, refresh, or a business imperative or cloud imperative, they all describe different stages of where an organization is with their strategy. For example, strategy first is an organization that starts with a formal cloud strategy before they begin the adoption process. So they define the vision, goals, objectives, tactics. That drives them toward a set of cloud implementation strategies. The backfill is where you're going forward with some cloud adoption, and then you decide, well, maybe we need a strategy after all. So you go back and you fill in the strategy, and that helps accelerate your cloud adoption. A strategy reset, as you might guess, is where you've started with a strategy. You might have had marginal success, but not what you hoped for. So you might go back and refresh your strategy and hit a reset on it to start over. The refresh is the next one, and that's where you're basically touching it up. You've had success, but you want more success, so you might go back and reimagine or re-envision your strategy and set a new set of goals. And a cloud imperative is one where cloud is absolutely critical to achieving a business objective. And a cloud imperative is ultra important, usually driven by and sponsored by the business leadership. And it leads to, again, a very transformative view of cloud. So the point with these strategy archetypes is that either mode of cloud adoption, the incremental model or the transformative model, can benefit from any of these strategy archetypes. They're all good, and again, both the incremental and the transformative adoption pattern for cloud will lead to enterprise value. It's a question of how much do you want to bite off and how much value are you trying to achieve. This illustration shows and contrasts the incremental approach versus the transformative approach. On the left, the incremental approach is where cloud is primarily applied within IT, to IT processes around infrastructure provisioning and within technology. On the other hand, the transformative model is where cloud is applied to the entire value chain of the enterprise. Hence, all the chevrons are blue in that case. So again, just showing one is a more limited adoption of cloud within IT, as opposed to the transformative view where the end-to-end value chain is looking to be cloud-enabled. So as we think about cloud going forward, ask yourself the question, are we trying to just accelerate IT, make IT more responsive, be able to improve the way we provision and provide infrastructure resources to the business? Or are we re-envisioning our entire business model around cloud computing? They require different strategies, and you can go from incremental to transformative just by updating your strategy. So things to keep in mind. With that, let's introduce the Cloud Readiness Domain Model. So in our capability model, we've sorted out 8 capability domains that, in our view, lead to the best posture for cloud computing adoption success. So the 8 domains are cloud-centric leadership, business strategy and finance, IT, organization and culture, cloud security, governance, procurement, and legal, portfolio readiness, and lastly, the cloud ecosystem. We'll talk about what each of these means and give you some best practices and some of the sample information we're looking for in each of these 8 capability domains. So first, let's talk cloud-centric leadership. What do we mean by cloud-centric leadership? And in our view, this cloud-centric leadership idea is really saying that for cloud computing to be successful, it requires not just leadership, but demonstrated, persistent leadership to help ensure success of that initiative. The cloud transformation or the incremental model requires leadership to set the environment, to set the tone, to create an atmosphere that's conducive to achieving the target goals of cloud, whether it's transformational or incremental. So cloud-centric leadership is key, and it's more than just the CIO, and it's more than the IT leadership. It also includes business leadership as well. And to the extent that you get business champions behind the cloud computing initiative, that's going to be a means by which you'll be able to tell how successful cloud will be. If you have business champions, I guarantee you a higher probability of success. So this cloud transformation leadership has to be established early on. It's got to be visible, it's got to be persistent, and it needs to really pave the way, set the tone for all the things that follow in cloud computing. The next domain is business strategy and financial readiness. So in this domain here, we're really talking about how prepared are the business stakeholders for cloud adoption. Is the business ready for this? Is there some pent-up frustration where the business really sees that cloud can help address some lack of responsiveness on the part of IT? What are the business things that are really making them ready to go with cloud computing? Do they need geographic expansion? Do they need some cloud enablement to support a product strategy or some other feature of the business strategy? So this business strategy and business readiness tries to get to those factors. On the financial readiness side, cloud computing drives this shift from a CapEx financial management model to an OpEx financial management model. Most financial organizations don't really like that budgeting and that financial management model. It's not as predictable as the CapEx model, where we have a set of predictable numbers that we carry across month to month. OpEx is a bit more challenging. It's a bit more unpredictable because, obviously, in cloud you pay for only what you use, and so it fluctuates. And so oftentimes, whether it's cloud computing or other initiatives like agile development, many of these new trends are challenging the financial processes in organizations, and it's the financial barriers that often are a drag on the success of some of these new initiatives. So continuing on in business readiness, we spend a bit of time on organizational readiness as well within the business units, within the divisions, within the regions if you're a large global enterprise. How ready are the various consumers in the business to start adopting cloud services? And lastly, in this domain segment, how cloud native are the products and other services? To the extent that cloud is being embedded in products and services, or as physical products are enhanced with digital products that rely on cloud computing capabilities, those are things that all will signify a pull signal from the business that they're ready for cloud. So this is really where the business stakeholders come into play in driving adoption. And this is the opportunity where, from a financial readiness perspective, we can anticipate and try and mitigate potential barriers from the financial community. The next domain is IT. Clearly, IT plays a significant role in the planning and execution of the cloud strategy. So in this domain, we're looking at the overall end-to-end IT readiness for cloud. In the readiness assessment model, we look at every aspect and dimension of IT to explore how ready it is from a domain perspective. We also look at IT as being ready to act as a cloud provider. So when IT is providing cloud services from a private cloud perspective, IT has to act almost like an Amazon or a Google or an Azure, and by that I mean IT is a cloud service provider in that mode. So they have to be able to live by their SLAs, provide customer support and service as if they're a cloud service provider, and so they have to behave almost as if they're a third-party provider, even though they're an internal organization. So IT really has to look at its overall provider capabilities, its technologies, its processes, its support capabilities as well. And continuing along that line, does IT have the necessary cloud architects, cloud application architects, solution architects, resources that are trained and ready to engage with business end users to support their cloud requirements? That will be a really important part of how IT will become successful as a cloud provider. Is there a cloud PMO or a cloud services team that's been created, funded, that owns the cloud initiative and drives and creates the provider relationships, helps get the services ready to be accessed and consumed from a self-service portal? These are all things that need to be taken into consideration. And lastly, from a technology perspective, do you have the basic technologies installed, implemented, tested, and ready? Do you have the monitoring and cloud management tools in place? Do you have the application monitoring and diagnostic tools so you can troubleshoot cloud-native apps? Do you have all your ITIL, IT service management processes ready to support this model? So there's a lot in this bucket. The IT domain is very, very crucial to cloud success, and hence it's one of the larger domains in our domain model to explore. Organization and culture feels soft. It's kind of one of the soft domains, but in our experience over the years, it's many of these soft issues are either why a technology initiative succeeds, or they explain why a technology initiative failed. So organizational readiness in this domain speaks to the culture and the demographics, the organizational structure. So again, if the organization, for example, is structured as a global enterprise with regional IT shops and business units dispersed around the world, you're going to have some different challenges with cloud adoption than with a different organizational structure where most people are co-located in a giant headquarters, everyone's visible and accessible to one another. That's a different set of challenges in that physical structure of that organization. From a demographic perspective, what's the relative average age of your enterprise? Do you have a lot of millennials in your organization? Are you a newer company with a younger, more millennial culture? Or are you a more mature, established organization with a different demographic? The demographic makeup of your enterprise, and more importantly, the demographic makeup of your leadership teams and the influencers to the leadership teams will play a large role in what things you need to do to be successful with cloud. Organizational design for cloud is something that's quite interesting because organizations can organize themselves structurally to benefit and enable a better cloud adoption scenario. So do you have shared services teams set up? Do you have cloud teams embedded into business units? How are you going to structure yourself to drive this cloud initiative? Furthermore, do you have awareness and communications to communicate across the enterprise and bring everybody up to par? The organization and cultural features of the domain model play an important role in cloud success. And so while it feels soft, I assure you this analysis will become one of the more important things to get a grip on in order to assure cloud computing success. Now, we can't talk cloud computing without talking cloud security. So the cloud security readiness is its own domain, even though we all recognize that cloud security touches most, if not all, of the other domains. But here, of course, we're talking about the overall security posture and security processes typically defined by the Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Security Architects and other stakeholders in that value chain. But we're concerned in this domain about the security strategy. Do you have policies, principles, and guidance defined and distributed so that everyone knows not only what the policies are, but what their role is in ensuring those policies are followed and adhered to? Is there a security architecture for the enterprise that defines how all the various features and facets of security are not only defined and architected, but implemented from an enabling technologies perspective, but also implemented as processes and capabilities that assure security is implemented? Do you have physical security for data centers and all the physical locations in place? What are the governance, compliance, and risk controls that revolve around security? And lastly, data security and privacy. Do you have controls around all of your data from an information lifecycle management perspective? This is a huge and very daunting domain. There's a lot of reasons why people are talking about cloud security, and rightfully so. But I will finish with the anecdote that even though most end-user organizations tend to be a little fearful of cloud service providers and outsourcing their infrastructure to a cloud service provider, the reality is that most cloud service providers have much better security for their operations than many end-user organizations. And so it becomes a matter of aligning your internal security policies and processes and guidance with those of your provider. And even though you might be outsourcing parts of security to a cloud service provider, at the end of the day, the end-user organization, the enterprise, is accountable for cloud security. So big, very important domain, and we've got a very comprehensive cloud security capability analysis in our model. This illustration shows the idea that cloud security threads through and touches almost every other domain, and hence it has such a priority role in our 360 cloud readiness domain model. The next domain is governance, legal, and procurement. We put those three together. They are related. So as you might imagine, cloud governance, compliance, and risk talks about all the things from a governance, policy enforcement, and oversight process that need to be considered. Oftentimes, the governance model needs to be updated and enhanced to deal with cloud computing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Your regulatory compliance requirements are also going to be challenged and need to be updated to make sure the cloud is accommodated and accounted for in your regulatory compliance. And if you've got some kind of a risk framework, many organizations do, especially in the more regulated industries like financial services and healthcare and certainly public service, federal government. So if there are risk frameworks, those need to be enhanced to deal with cloud computing. On the procurement side, it's really updating your contract acquisition and procurement processes to make sure they can manage the due diligence and vendor management for cloud service providers. So there's a lot of new questions and things to consider in a contract with a cloud service provider. Things like the terms, performing the due diligence, getting the pricing comparisons, performance and other vendor comparisons in place, doing the vendor onboarding, and then the service onboarding with the providers, and things like vendor lock-in avoidance and provider portability come to mind. So if you're planning on going into the cloud with certain workloads, you should at that time be thinking about the portability of moving to a different provider or bringing those workloads back home to mothership. You need to design those into your initial service provider relationships and contracts. Lastly, in procurement, somewhere in this model, there needs to be a provider relationship management process where you've got people and resources assigned to working with your cloud providers, not only on the contractual and vendor management functions, but also in managing their service portfolio and doing R&D on new services that each provider will offer, and making sure that as you introduce those into your service catalog that you've got a product management mentality in releasing new services to your end users. Lastly, from a legal perspective, there's a lot in the legal bucket, but along with procurement and acquisition comes legal review of contracts, risk exposures and remedies, all the normal things you will find from a legal perspective, force majeure, termination, et cetera, indemnification. So you know what I'm talking about. So these things all become very important parts of the cloud domain model and things to be considered. Going back to cloud governance, what you really should be doing is think about this whole cloud governance lifecycle top to bottom, from the cloud strategy and planning to architecture, design, and deployment of cloud services, through to cloud acquisition and vendor selection, to resource provisioning and management, and finally at the bottom, the cloud operations and runtime management. So there's a lot of governance touch points if you decompose the entire end-to-end cloud governance lifecycle, and so it behooves the enterprise to think about where its exposures are in its governance model and then make sure that it inserts the governance and requirements for cloud into those gaps. So the cloud governance lifecycle is one mechanism that you might consider to evaluate and close potential governance gaps. The next domain is portfolio readiness. So when we talk about portfolio readiness, we're talking about your legacy application portfolio and making decisions around how and what and when to migrate to the cloud. So in this domain, we're talking about making sure you've done an application portfolio inventory. You've got it completed and it's accurate. Once you've got that done, you need to do the appropriate analysis to really identify which workloads can move immediately without any changes, which workloads can move with some virtualization maybe being put in place, maybe some patching and upgrades, which applications in your portfolio need some significant replatforming or refactoring or microservice enablement, rehosting, whatever it may be. So those take a little bit more work. So as you look at this portfolio analysis, the trick is to do the cost-benefit analysis so that things you move today might be able to fund investments in re-architecting some of the other more pesky candidates in your application portfolio. So that will lead you to doing the cloud migration planning, doing the cost estimates, the resourcing, and obviously with that becomes the return on the investment and the payback model. So how soon will you recoup the investments in your cloud migration where you can reinvest those funds into attacking the other members of your application portfolio? And lastly, anytime we have legacy portfolio issues, you need to look at the risks. There's a series of risks that attend a portfolio modernization. Those risks include operational risk, revenue risk, customer risk, on and on. And so make sure that you accommodate for all the risks and come up with mitigation plans for migrating application candidates and workloads into your target cloud environment. This is a big one and a very important step. In this picture here, we show a notional technology decision framework around looking at your portfolio candidates and deciding what do we not change at all, what do we keep on-prem, what do we retire, what do we outsource, what do we refactor and move, what can we move immediately. So this just shows, again, a conceptual idea of different cloud service models we would apply to the portfolio and other disposition decisions we would make with respect to individual portions of your application portfolio. The last domain is the cloud ecosystem, one of my favorites. And when I use the term cloud ecosystem, what I'm really talking about is all of the technologies, all of the organizational capabilities, all of the resources and skills, everything you need to successfully connect a cloud consumer to a cloud provider and allow your enterprise to achieve its targeted goals. So the cloud ecosystem are all those connectivities that enable business value to be realized. So in the cloud ecosystem are the appropriate cloud capabilities. Do you have some kind of a portal or a broker platform? Do you have a cloud service catalog built? That might be ITIL compliant or maybe not. Do you have the cloud management and monitoring tools installed? Do you have the hybrid cloud tooling and management in place? Is your cloud security and identity and access management tooling up to par? Do you have the cloud PMO or a cloud services team ready? Are they trained? Are there cloud architects trained and ready to engage with the business? Do you have your support and IT ops resources trained and ready to support cloud-native apps and troubleshoot cloud-enabled and cloud-native apps? Do you have the full end-to-end cloud support processes in place, from an identified need of cloud to a fully deployed application that's being pushed into production? So do you have those things in place? And lastly, do you have the full ecosystem, the technologies, processes, tools, etc., that are ready to allow you to start migrating your internal workloads into the cloud? So this cloud ecosystem, it's more than just the tools, it's more than the personnel, it's the entire kit and caboodle of the cloud ecosystem that allows you to achieve your benefits. That's what I mean by cloud ecosystem. So that is the eighth domain in our domain model, and as you can see, it's quite comprehensive, and in our view provides a full 360-degree view of your capabilities and overall readiness for cloud computing success. So with that domain model overview completed, let's talk about the readiness process and the methodology by which we conduct and perform cloud readiness analyses on behalf of organizations. So this is a process view of our cloud readiness methodology, starting top left with pre-readiness preparation and beginning at the bottom right with a beginning to deploy the cloud and migrate candidates into the cloud. So as you can see, we have a readiness discovery phase, a readiness analysis and gap identification phase, a phase where we present findings to the organization, and then we make a decision of, are we ready to go, yes or no? And if you're ready to go, you can start migrating workloads to the cloud. If you're not ready, there might be some readiness remediations to be done, and we'll talk about what they are. Ultimately, if you do readiness remediations, basically closing capability gaps, then you'll be ready to start deploying and migrating capabilities to the cloud. Let's take each of these in turn. Pre-readiness prep. What we mean here is the things you need to do before we conduct an on-site readiness assessment. So many organizations might want to do a self-assessment on their own. And so in those cases, we have a cloud readiness self-assessment template that we'll provide that will let you do a readiness self-assessment before we come on site and do the formal third-party assessment. Something else to do is a readiness preparation is have your application portfolio inventory done. You should also think about creating awareness with the key stakeholders that will be involved in the formal on-site readiness assessment so they know what's coming. So have a project overview, send out some sample interview questions, things like that are just things that prepare the organization for this readiness assessment. You might distribute a project summary to key stakeholders, and again, you might consider just some sample interview questions to some of the key stakeholders as well. These are all things, it's not everything, but just some ideas on the pre-readiness preparations you might consider before we actually embark on a formal readiness assessment. Readiness discovery is next, and this is where we actually are on-site now working with an end-user enterprise, and we're doing on-site data collection, we're doing on-site interviews with stakeholders, we're evaluating documentation that might be provided to us either ahead of time, which is kind of advanced data collection, or additional documents that are provided while we're on site. During this readiness discovery, that's where we start to do the preliminary analysis. We identify big headlines, big ahas, as well as our normal findings and observations that we cluster around each of the domains. And then we also ask a magic wand question. It's kind of the unconstrained, if you could change anything, what would you do? You would be amazed at the information you glean with a magic wand. And so hence we built that into our readiness discovery process. So readiness discovery is all about gather data and analyze data. When we do the formal analysis post-discovery, This is where we crank all the findings against our domain model. We identify gaps. We identify the big headlines. We prioritize gaps. We actually create close plans for the gaps and include those in the final briefing. So the whole analysis of gap identification is where we actually make the sausage. We take all the information and findings and observations. We put them into a structured analysis template that will lead us to a very customized and tailored set of recommendations for your organization. Third phase here is the client briefing and next steps. So we present our findings to the client team. So we provide it in the form of a formal presentation. And this is the opportunity for the engagement team to present our findings to the stakeholders. And it's the opportunity for the stakeholders to ask us questions about what our findings were. And it's here where we talk about the recommendations and a prioritized roadmap that helps close the gaps if there are any. And we also end up doing next steps planning in this phase. So a summary roadmap would notionally include recommendations for key observations, but also, again, just traffic light reporting on where your capabilities are, where your major gaps are, and the specific actions and steps you'll want to take to remediate any potential gaps that we found. So these reports will be very comprehensive, very useful things to use as learning tools to prepare your organization for the successful adoption of cloud computing. Lastly, in our model, again, on the assumption that there might be one or two gaps or a few more perhaps, there's a post-readiness remediation. That's what we call it, but essentially this is where we take our recommendations and the readiness roadmap and we close the gaps working with the client organization. And so this is typically done as a follow-on engagement, and it might include things like, well, we didn't have a formal strategy, but now we need a formal cloud strategy. Can you help? It might involve doing a business case. It might involve helping out with the legacy portfolio analysis in support of the cloud migration. It might be a cloud governance or a security process review where we help with those areas. It might result in just doing some basic training and awareness for business and IT. It could be an organizational design around optimizing your enterprise structure for cloud. So it could take any number of dimensions. Again, these will all be driven by specific gaps and findings and the readiness roadmap that we develop in our analysis. So based on the completion of a readiness thing, you might be ready to go, and we're here to help. But as you think about the domain model we've created, 360 Cloud Transformation Readiness Domain Model, it's really meant to be a tool to look at your capabilities and help you prepare for cloud, whether you're on a more narrow, limited adoption within IT, or whether you're really looking at it in a transformative frame of mind and looking to really leapfrog your enterprise ahead of your peer competition. So to get there, there's a few things that we suggest you consider doing tomorrow. So one of them is you might consider doing a self-assessment of your cloud readiness. So the self-assessments, again, are based on the domain model. There's the 8 domains. So there's one flavor of this, includes subsets of all 8 domains to give you the full 360. We have a subset also that's just an IT readiness model. So we have 2 flavors of self-assessments that are available to consider. The next thing you might do is make sure that you have the appropriate leadership commitment behind this initiative. And key emphasis here is both business and IT stakeholders. If you can get a business champion or 2, you're going to increase the odds of success by magnitude. So get that leadership commitment. It does set the tone and pave the way for cloud computing success. Third, make sure your cloud adoption model is scoped and scaled to what your goals are. So this, again, kind of circles back to whether you're looking at an incremental approach or whether you're looking at a transformative approach. The adoption scope and scale and your target objectives are going to be different. So just be sure that you have alignment around what your adoption planning is relative to your target scope and goal. Next is develop a cloud strategy and roadmap. Even if it's a simple rudimentary tool, do it. Have some kind of a planning session where you can lay out a set of goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics, and document it. It needs to be formal, but it doesn't have to be complex. And so a cloud strategy does give you the compass points and a map to get you to your destination. And lastly, think about your governance model end-to-end and consider doing a cloud governance lifecycle decomposition to identify any potential policy, oversight, or governance enforcement gaps that might exist in your enterprise and close those gaps. Think about it from a security, data security, and a regulatory and risk management perspective, and you'll be fine. So those are 5 of the things that we would suggest you start thinking about doing tomorrow. And that concludes the formal track of the 360 Cloud Readiness Transformation Model. And with that, we have time for questions. So I'll ask Makiko to facilitate the Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Eric. And I think with your comprehensive look at planning a cloud transformation, I think it's probably given a lot of people some thought onto how they would approach it. And I do have a couple of questions here from our attendees. The first question, why are cloud readiness capabilities more important than cloud readiness maturity is the question. So the difference between capabilities and maturity.
Yeah, and that's, boy, if you go and read online, look at capability versus maturity models, and you'll get a bunch of hits from the CMMI model, if any of you are familiar with that. And then what you'll end up getting caught up in is what's a capability versus a process. What's capability maturity versus process maturity? So I try and simplify this as best I can. The capabilities are the fundamental value chain building blocks of things that you need to be able to do well to differentiate your enterprise and function. So these capabilities in the Cloud Readiness Framework are capabilities that will have an impact on cloud success. Again, the maturity approach really says, okay, let's put a 1 to 5 scale around all of your processes and see where you are, 1 to 5, and so you get the snapshot in time. And the maturity model can help you make some steps to improve where you might be immature. But again, the static nature of maturity models is where I'm going here. This capability model we've created is very much more dynamic and very much organized around the capabilities that will influence or directly drive cloud computing success. So I hope that answered the question.
Perfect. Yes. Next question. You actually pointed out in the webinar there that cloud security is very top of mind for a lot of enterprises. So the question is, cloud security continues to be a hot button for organizations and a barrier to adopting more public cloud services. Why should we trust organizations like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google? Case in point, Equifax, and I think everyone knows what we're talking about there. So, yeah, can you talk a little bit about cloud security and sort of the barriers for organizations?
Yeah, and I did touch on this during that portion of the domain model overview. But the fact of the matter is, these best-in-class cloud providers, and again, there's many of them, but we all know the big ones. It's the Googles, the Amazons, the Azures. I'm telling you right now, their security practices are first-rate and best-in-class. And the chances are that they're going to be better than most end-user enterprises for the mere fact that they have to be in order to succeed as cloud service providers. So they have to be bulletproof, they have to survive ISO audits, third-party audits, and audits by all of their clients as well. So the providers have outstanding end-to-end cloud security. Chances are it's going to be better than the end users. But that said, your job as the end user, putting your data or building your apps based on a public provider's cloud services, it's your due diligence that will help ensure that your security requirements are met and that your cloud service providers are able to support your needs. Because at the end of the day, even though you're outsourcing, in effect, parts of your IT infrastructure to a service provider, you, the end user organization, are accountable for all of the security requirements. And so do your due diligence, and our cloud security framework will help in making sure you've got all the right questions that you're asking of your providers.
Excellent. All right. Next question is, the readiness domain model has a lot of quote-unquote soft dimensions, and I think you've mentioned that, such as organization, culture, and leadership. How are these important in having a successful cloud adoption?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I did touch on it, but it needs more emphasis. These soft issues, culture, the organizational structure, demographics, what your organization stands toward technology in general, they're all going to influence how successful cloud computing is going to be from a business perspective. And I can't emphasize enough to don't short shrift the soft parts of our cloud readiness domain model. Spend the time looking at similar technology initiatives, for example, in the past. How has your organization done with big technology initiatives? Have they been successful? Have they failed? If they failed or struggled, why? I can assure you the answers are going to lie somewhere in the soft skills arena. And so spend the time thinking about your demographics, your structure, the physical distribution of the organization, how you get different cloud champions in the business. All these things are going to help assure a better odds of success if you do pay attention to them. So I can't emphasize enough that these soft dimensions play an outsized role in the success of technology initiatives. And also, again, think about your organization's stance toward technology. Some organizations culturally are late adopters, and they want to wait till technology's on the mature side before they join the party. Some are very aggressive technology shapers, and so they're always on the front edge of technology adoption. And so those are the ones that are shaping and creating technology, contributing to the open source tools and technologies that are driving today's technology trends. So your organization has a position. Think about where you are in the technology adoption life cycle, and that fact alone will help you frame your cloud adoption strategies and tactics. So the soft dimensions of this do play an outsized role, even though we feel like, it's that soft stuff, that culture stuff. It really does matter.
Excellent. All right. I think this is probably the last question that I can take. So the last question: how do we prepare the business and the business and finance for cloud? So I get why they're important for cloud adoption, but what are some things we can do to help move them into the 21st century?
So the business side, let me take the business one first. It's essential, I mentioned earlier, to have business sponsorship in to help assure cloud success. So it's really up to you to go and look across the business and recruit business champions that they might tend to be a little on the younger side. It's not an age thing I'm going for here, but younger in spirit. Think about the ones that are technology innovators and try and find pockets or embeds where you can get a business champion and bring them into the party, so to speak, have them become a business cloud champion on behalf of IT. And they're out there. They might even be older folks, but some of the older folks are actually some of the more interesting technology adopters because they're just always looking out ahead at new technology. So it's a recruiting exercise. Go recruit, find some business champions, and have them embedded in the business to create the demand side of the cloud equation. Because without demand, without cloud consumption, you're not going to achieve your target value. You need demand to drive the providing side of the equation. So that's the one thing, probably the first thing I would do is find your business champions, recruit them, incentivize them to help. On the finance side, you're never going to get a financial champion for these things. But what you want to do is get their pre-buy-in so that they're not a barrier. So that means engaging with finance early and upfront to make sure you can identify any risks or issues that they're going to have, and then work with them to try and put in place processes, mechanisms, financial models that will help them overcome the shift from CapEx to OpEx financial management, that will help them get into a buy infrastructure ahead of demand. That's what we actually used to do prior to cloud being so mainstream. Just getting finance to spend money on infrastructure before the business needed it was often a challenge, because that's how you shorten the provisioning time for infrastructure for business projects. Well, with cloud, we have to get finance to change the way we buy services from providers, and furthermore, to push buying limits down to the individual end users. So what are the ways in which we can get to that radical self-service approach for IT services and fully democratize how cloud services are accessed and consumed by the business users? You need financial people to buy in, and the way to do that is, again, you're never going to get them to love it, but at least let's make them so they're not a barrier later on.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Eric. So it's pretty much an hour on the dot, so we'll wrap it up there. Any final words, Eric?
No, what I would say, well, yes, as a matter of fact, what I would say is this readiness model is very deep and complex and comprehensive. It's not that hard, but it is a full 360 view. So we think if you follow along with it and give it a shot, it will prepare you for success with cloud, again, in either scenario that we described. A modest, limited approach, or more appropriately, as we start thinking about cloud native and cloud native computing, it will certainly help you get to the transformative value of cloud to a more cloud native approach. So thank you, everybody, for spending some time with us, and we hope to hear from you down the road.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for attending. As I mentioned at the top of the presentation, we will be sending attendees a recording of the webinar, and also we will be posting the slides as well. So I will keep you updated on that in the days to come. Thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us today.